Anomalies.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is a program about things seen out of the corner of one's eye, about shadows and what lurks in those shadows. This is a program about the unexplained and the unexplainable.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. I'm one of your hosts, Dan, and with me, beside a very special guest today, is my broadcast partner, Dave. You know, Dave, you and I have had discussions about UFOs for a long time. What's the first, and I think you've told me this, but I'm at such an advanced age that my memory doesn't work very well. What's the first UFO book you ever read?
Well, hi, Dan, and hi, Kathleen. We'll get to Kathleen in just a moment. My first book was J. Allen Hynek's The UFO Experience, and I walked into a used bookstore in Pullman, Washington, the site of Washington State University, where I went to college, and it was just sitting there like on the floor. It was about $1, I think, and I walked past it, and I did a double take, and I picked it up, and it was all, worn and ratty and had markings on it and stuff. And I said, well, this looks kind of interesting. And so I bought it for 75 cents or whatever it was, $1. And I read it and it kind of blew my mind. This was in the late 80s, early 90s maybe. And from that point on, I realized there was something very significant going on. I still haven't figured out exactly what it is, but that was the moment, really. I'd always been interested in E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, those sorts of movies. But that was it for me. What about you, Dan? Kathleen.
This gets really pertinent to our guest that we'll be introducing here shortly. I read John Fuller's The Interrupted Journey, and that blew my mind. The fact that somebody was abducted by supposedly creatures from another planet and experimented upon, and I mean, that was just pretty astounding. And that was back, I think, in 1966, somewhere around there. So that's been a while ago. But the reason we're excited about our guests tonight, for a lot of reasons, but the main reason is that The Interrupted Journey is about Betty and Barney Hill, who I believe may have been the first publicized humans to be abducted by some kind of extraterrestrial or non-human entities. And Kathleen Marden, who's with us tonight, is Betty and Barney Hill's niece. So we're going to get a really interesting perspective on who they were and the experience that they went through. So Kathleen, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, it's great to be with you. And that was the first UFO book I ever read too.
Real? Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, probably. I guess I would say I would almost expect that too. So, I was thinking about how I wanted to start this. And rather than jump into what happened to Betty and Barney, I think a better place to jump in is who were Betty and Barney. Now, they're your aunt and uncle. Were your aunt and uncle, still are. They both passed now. But what I would be interested in hearing from you is, who were these individuals as people?
Oh, I love to talk about them.
Good.
Because I was so fond of them growing up. I was 13 when their experience occurred in New Hampshire's White Mountains. Betty was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. She worked in child welfare and adoption, and was also very active in the civil rights movement. And Barney worked for the post office, and he had served honorably in the Army during World War II, had his release letter said that he was of excellent character, and he was then hired by the post office and had worked in Philadelphia. And when he and Betty started courting, he remained there until a year after they were married. And then he moved to New Hampshire with Betty because she refused to move to Philadelphia. She wanted to be in the country, even though it was a small city, and near her family. We had a very close family. So, and Betty and Barney were both very involved in the civil rights movement. In fact, Barney was appointed by the governor to serve on New Hampshire's U.S. Civil Rights Commission. And of course, that was federal, but he was the New Hampshire representative to that. They also worked together to set up the Rockingham County Community Action Program in Rockingham County, New Hampshire, and Barney served as the first chairman of the board of directors of that organization. They were very, very active in civil rights and equal rights and programs for people who were less fortunate because of their financial means. And so through the Office of Economic Opportunity, Barney was awarded a certificate by Sergeant Shriver. So you can see they were very prominent politically in the state of New Hampshire. In fact, Barney was a delegate to Lyndon Johnson's inauguration. And I, as a teenager, was campaigning as much as I could because they were always giving me guidance. They wanted to make sure that I was successful. And I received an invitation to go to Lyndon Johnson's inauguration. And so the three of us went together. And, you know, I think that was the experience of my life. It was fantastic.
Wow. So, and we're generally hearing who they were, but if you were going to kind of distill their personalities down a little bit further, who was Barney? What kind of guy was he?
Barney was highly intelligent, well-read, spoke extremely well, kind, cordial, funny. He took a real interest in the children in the family and our schoolwork. We knew that he was going to be looking at our report cards, and we worked really hard because he was interested in us and seeing us become successful in things like school. He and Betty took us out to dinner and taught us proper restaurant manners, and took us to the Museum of Science in Boston. And, you know, they were very interested in our cultural development. My parents would go along too, but they were the ones who invited us.
No, is it correct that your mom was Betty's sister?
That's correct. My mother, Janet Miller, was Betty's sister.
Okay.
Younger sister.
And so how would you describe Betty then, kind of compared to Barney?
Betty was very funny. She had a great sense of humor, but she was determined, and she didn't care what anyone thought because she knew that she was right in what she wanted in the civil rights movement, in just about anything she wanted, in fact. But she was a great family member, the oldest child in her family, and she loved to garden. She grew up on a small farm in New Hampshire, and she loved chickens. She kept a few chickens out in her yard at her house in Portsmouth, which was a small city, but she had it fenced in. She liked children. She was very interested in education and in the way that people raised their children. She had her ideas about what was proper and what was not. And she believed that all children should not be socializing with their friends after school. They should have chores. And in order to be successful and to have good self-esteem, they needed to work for it as part of their family, to see that they, as a family, accomplished everything they needed to accomplish.
So let's fast forward now to September of 1961, when they are coming home to New Hampshire from a trip to Montreal, I believe, kind of a vacation getaway. So what happens there in the White Mountains? How would you start that narrative?
Well, they stopped when they arrived in New Hampshire at Colebrook, which is the furthest small city in northern New Hampshire. Just had a cup of coffee, a little snack, and they were on their way south. And about, maybe 30 miles south of Colebrook, they were just south of Lancaster, another small city. And Betty saw a new light in the sky. And what drew her curiosity to it was that instead of moving like a falling star, it flew upward.
Yeah.
And so she was looking at it, and she was wondering, could this be a satellite? My brother and I would go out nights with my grandfather and look for satellites in the sky when, Sputnik was launched.
Sputnik, right?
Yes. And I even had a cat named Sputnik.
That's great. That's great. I like that.
I was
a lot harder to find satellites back then, right? Now you can find them every night, multiple. But did you find satellites?
Yes, we did. We had to know what time it was going to be coming our way. Mm-hmm. And so we would go out and look up into the sky and see them. But Betty had never seen one in the sky. And so she was wondering, could this be what this is? But then she was watching it. It was a bright light night. The moon was about 3/4 full. And it began to grow larger and larger in the sky. And Barney was paying attention to his driving. And they were now down to Twin Mountain, just south of Twin Mountain, moving toward the southern part of northern New Hampshire. And Betty said, Barney, you have to stop. And he didn't want to stop. But then she said, well, our dog Delcy needs to go for a walk.
There's a third being in this picture, their dog.
Yes, and she was Kathleen, a little dachshund.
Let me just ask here: is this because you're a source? I mean, you're close to the source. Is this how you're describing the event? Is this from Betty and Barney themselves? I mean, did they relay the story to you?
That's from the hypnosis tapes. I have all the hypnosis tapes. That's what they told Dr. Simon.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure. But so you never talked to them. Well, I mean, you can tell us what your interaction was with them, but continue with the story. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt there.
Yes. Well, I did many times drive along the close encounter route with Betty, and she gave me a lot of information there. But then there was other information that I retrieved from the hypnosis tapes and put it all together.
Okay.
So they did stop at Twin Mountain. It was a picnic area, and got out of the car. Barney had the binoculars first, and Betty had the binoculars first and was looking up into the sky, and she was saying, Barney, that's really unusual looking. You need to have a look at this. And he was there, well, I have to walk Delcy. So, he knew they were at a picnic area. He was afraid that there were bears in the area. So he went into the trunk of the car and got a gun out that it was actually Betty's pistol that she had put there. And the reason for that was that when Barney was married to his first wife, his wife and his sons went to Detroit on vacation. And he wished that he had a gun with him because they had to pull over to the side of the road to sleep, and he was worried that they might be robbed. So that's what entered his mind when he put the gun into the trunk of the car. So he walked the dog, put the dog back into the car, and Betty said, Barney, you need to look at this thing. So he said, okay, give me the binoculars. And he looked up into the sky, and he saw that this was unusual, very unusual. And it was not moving like a conventional aircraft. It was doing a little zigzagging and that kind of thing, bouncing close to him and then back in the sky. And he got back into the car and said to Betty, "Forget about it. It's just a commercial aircraft going into Montreal." And so that he drove south, and this craft came in closer and closer beside the car, and then in front of the car. And they entered Franconia Notch. It's a beautiful section of New Hampshire where the Old Man of the Mountain, which was the state symbol, used to be. It fell off the mountain in 2004. And so they were driving along, and before they got to the Old Man of the Mountain, there was a ski area, Cannon Mountain. So they saw this craft go over the top of Cannon Mountain, and there was a lighted building up there. And when the craft passed over the building, the light blinked out, meaning there could have been electromagnetic interference there. They continued to travel, but stopped again at the Old Man of the Mountain. It was just, this object was really becoming interesting to them, and they were trying to identify what it was. And Barney was insisting that it had to be a conventional aircraft because he knew that there were no such things as flying saucers, as they were called in those days, and that it was impossible for anyone from any other star system or planet to come to our planet. And he was very firm in that belief. So they got out of the car again, and Barney became more and more interested in this thing because he saw something that frightened him. This object was next to the old man's profile, which was 48 feet from forehead to chin, and it appeared to be rotating. They could see what appeared to be lights on one side of it, and it appeared to be at least 1.5 times to 2 times the length of the old man's profile. So they got back into the car and headed south, and Barney was saying, "Well, we'd better get going. We have to get home." And so they were driving south, and they entered the tourist area. They left Franconia Notch and entered the area where there are tourist attractions and motels and cabins, that sort of thing, in 1961. And they passed by the Indian Head Resort, which had a lot of cabins in those days. It's a beautiful resort today. And today, if you go there, you're going to see a marker.
Yes, I've heard about
New
that.
Hampshire erected to commemorate their experience. They were about a mile south of that marker, where that marker stands today, when that craft suddenly swooped ahead and stopped above the highway. Barney had to stop the car so that he wouldn't be directly underneath it. And he moved the car sort of to the middle of the road as well, and got out of the car, grabbed the binoculars, and stood on the road looking up at through the binoculars at this craft. Betty was in the front seat looking up too. And what they described was, at that point, a huge pancake-shaped craft with a lighted front. It had intense blue-white light, and there appeared to be a little red light on each side of that, what appeared to be a pancake. And so Barney's looking up at it. He steps back from the car, and when he did, the craft shifted to an adjacent field. Well, that field was a little apple orchard. There was a farm stand there. And he took the binoculars again. He's looking up at this craft as he walks into the field. The craft has now descended. It's only about 100 feet from him and about 50 feet off the ground. And he's looking and he sees figures. This was part of his conscious recall. It was part of the early reports that he made to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. So he's standing there looking up at the entities on the craft. He knows that they're dressed in black, shiny uniforms. They're somehow not human. He can see them from about their knees up to the tops of their heads in front of these windows. And then suddenly, in military fashion, all but one turned and went to a panel on the back of this hallway that seemed to be encircling the craft. And when they did that, those little red lights extended out further on little wings, little tiny ones, and something started to drop down from underneath the craft. He didn't know what it was at that time, but he knew something was dropping down. And that entity, the one who remained at the window, was saying telepathically to him somehow, just stay there and keep looking. Stay there and keep looking. And when that thing started to drop down from underneath that craft, Barney became immediately terrified because he thought that they had a plan. And that plan was to catch him like, quote, a bug in a net, close quote. He pulled the binoculars from his eyes so violently that he broke the strap. And wow. He went screaming back to the car in a hysterical condition to Betty, we have to get out of here or we are going to be captured. They want to capture us. And Barney got into the car. It had been left running. He threw it into gear. But as he entered the car, he noticed the craft had moved in his direction again. And so he went speeding down the highway. And he said to Betty, roll down your window and look up. I think it's above us. She rolled down the window. She stuck her head out. She looked up. She was looking for lights and she didn't see lights. All she saw was blackness. And then within moments, she and Barney heard a series of code-like buzzing sounds that were striking the trunk of their vehicle. In fact, it bothered the dog's ears. She was in the back seat and she stood up, looking up out of that window with her ears up. And when that happened, a tingling sensation started to pass through Betty's and Barney's bodies, kind of electrical tingling. And the car began to vibrate. The next thing they knew, they were 35 miles down the highway. They remembered a little bit about what happened in the interim. They thought they had turned off or had somehow found themselves on a different road, a dirt road, and off the highway. They remembered encountering a roadblock somewhere. They didn't know where or when that occurred. And they remembered a fiery orb that seemed to be sitting on the ground. When they found themselves 35 miles down the road, they heard another series of these buzzing sounds. And Betty said to Barney, now do you believe in flying saucers? And Barney said, Betty, don't be ridiculous. There's no such thing as flying saucers. He said, let me prove to you that a flying saucer didn't make that buzzing sound. So he stopped the car. He drove up from one side of the road to the other, and he could not create that sound. So then, Betty always liked to be the top dog. So it would be, well, I told you so, Barney, that kind of thing.
Huh.
And they just drove south after that. They were looking for a restaurant that was open. They wanted to get a cup of coffee, and nothing was open. They finally arrived in their hometown of Portsmouth on the seacoast. And when they arrived, it was 5:15 in the morning. They anticipated an arrival at some time between 2 and 3 in the morning, even allowing for the stops that they made. So there was missing time there that they couldn't account for. Also, they went in, they felt into the house, they felt dirty, that something had happened to them, that maybe they were contaminated because that craft was so close to them. And they took long showers, and Barney was going to go out to the car and get the suitcases out of the trunk. And Betty said, well, don't bring them into the house. Put them outside on the back porch. And so he did. There was a cooler out there and a little camp stove. And they did not want any of these things inside the house because they feared contamination. Also, Barney went into the bathroom. He noticed that his shoes were deeply scraped and on the toes, and he didn't know how that occurred. He was a meticulous dresser, and he would certainly not wear shoes that had that kind of appearance. He had pickers and vegetative debris on his pant legs, and his shoulders were sore. His neck was sore. He felt that something had happened to his genitals. He checked his genitals out, and they looked fine. Betty felt dirty too. She took her dress off, and when she did, she noticed that it was torn in several places. The hem was torn down on one side. The lining was torn from waist to hemline. There was a 2-inch tear in the stitching on the zipper that ran down the back of her dress. And there was a 1-inch tear in the thick zipper fabric itself. She had no explanation for how that had occurred. It was in perfectly fine condition when she put it on the day before, or earlier that same day, the morning of that same day. Now, I guess it was after midnight, wasn't it? No explanation for these things. The binocular strap was broken. The watches that they had been wearing were wind-up watches, and they were also broken. Wouldn't work again. In fact, the watch that I think that Betty was wearing that night said 5:15. So that's what I think it said.
So up to this point, I mean, it gets more interesting after this, of course.
Yeah.
Betty and Barney, as you've described, they're very intelligent, rational, logical, very lucid people in general. And we start to see this phenomenon that we've seen many times since, many reports at least about this type of phenomenon. Your understanding of their personalities at this point, they're acting a little out of character. Is that right? I mean, it doesn't sound like they're really understanding what was happening, and they were both of the same mind in that they didn't necessarily recognize how bizarre the past several hours had been. Is that accurate, do you think?
Well, yes, they were aware that they had lost this time. They couldn't remember how it could possibly have been lost. They knew how long it took to travel from Lincoln, New Hampshire, Indian Head, that area down to their home in Portsmouth. They couldn't explain why it had taken so long. There were many perplexing things. And that's why Betty called my mother And I was home from school in the afternoon when my mother was on the phone with Betty. And she was concerned and wanted to speak to a neighbor of ours who was a physicist, to ask the physicist what they should do about this experience they had.
So she still was very lucid and rational in the face of something that was essentially unexplainable at that point.
Absolutely.
And even to this point. So, I mean, that's impressive that she was able to come through that and still maintain, that sort of inquisitive nature. It doesn't sound like they really freaked out or anything other than Barney's kind of, we got to get out of here, which is a very common report also of these sorts of incidents.
Yes. Betty was a very brave woman. As a social worker for the state, she one time had an escaped criminal. He'd escaped from jail, and one of her foster children was with him in a hotel room, his girlfriend. And the police were there around the hotel, and Betty went up, knocked on the door, and said, "I'm here to get you. Come out right now." And the girl did. So that's the kind of person Betty was. She was married to a black man in 1960.
Yeah.
So she was brave. And Barney was as well. He was a brave man with a mind of his own.
So, yeah.
Go ahead, Dave. Go ahead. No.
Well, no, I was just interested in hearing where it went from that point. But go ahead if you have a question.
No, go ahead.
The physicist said, if you have a compass, take it out to your car and see how the needle reacts. And at that time, they thought it was to test radiation, but we obviously know that it isn't. It would test a magnetic field. Mm-hmm. And so I think that physicist knew something about UFOs that Betty and Barney didn't know. And so Betty looked for that compass, found it, and took it out to the car. She started on the side of the car. And then when she got to the trunk of the car, where she and Barney heard those beeping sounds or buzzing sounds, there were shiny spots. And she held the compass over the trunk of the car, and the needle whirled and continued to whirl, which is highly unusual. And
this physicist, I'm already intrigued, because what are the odds of having a physicist live next door or anywhere near? I mean, do we know the identity of this person?
I have not made his name known for his own privacy.
Sure. It's just curious. I mean, maybe coincidental or synchronicity or something, but that intrigued me, that part of the story. But anyway, the spinning needle is also intriguing. So let's keep going there.
Yes. So Betty called down the people who lived upstairs from her. She owned an apartment house and she lived on the first floor, but she rented 2 apartments upstairs. So she called the people who lived up there. The man was in the Air Force, and they went down and they saw how the needle would spin and spin. And Barney was refusing to go out. And he just didn't want to think about any of this. He was protecting himself. But Betty shamed him into going out by going into the house and just saying, "Well, Barney, you have to see this. The neighbors have seen it. Everybody's seen it but you." And so he said, "All right, Betty, I'll go out." And so he went out to the trunk of the car and he used the compass, and the needle would spin and spin for him as well. And his reply to that was, "Oh, don't worry about that, Betty. It's only a cheap compass." Attempting to protect himself from any of the evidence that was there that he would have to think about. And after that, they called Pease Air Force Base. The reason they called is because my father's best friend had been the chief of police in Newton, New Hampshire. He stopped by every night for coffee on his way home from work. And he told my mother that Pease Air Force Base had notified the police stations that if anyone made a UFO report, if they'd seen a UFO, they should report it to Pease Air Force Base. So being the good citizens that Betty and Barney were, they called Pease and they filed a report, a Project Blue Book report. And the officer who took the report was very interested and said that that he wanted to get back to them. And he did get back to them the following day and said, just by coincidence, we had a radar report the same night at 2:14 a.m. of a craft. And so, they didn't know if it was a coincidence or what happened, but it was strange. And then Betty, being very curious after that, decided to go to the Portsmouth Public Library and see if she could find a book on UFOs. She'd never read a book on UFOs. So she went to the library and she found a book written by NICAP director Donald Kehoe. And that is when she and Barney wrote a letter to NICAP and described what they had observed. And in that letter, she talked about the unusual movement of the craft, the zigzag movement, the stair-step movement. And she also talked about how frightened Barney was and how he observed figures dressed in black shiny uniforms, and that he seemed to be developing a mental block, and wondered if there was a psychologist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist that they knew of who used hypnosis, because she thought that it would help Barney. Actually, it was my father who suggested it initially. And, within a couple of days of the time that happened to Betty and Barney, my father, my mother, my two brothers who were younger than me, and I went to Betty's and Barney's house. I saw the spots on the trunk of the car, along with my mother, along with my brothers. My father stayed in the house talking with Barney. Barney was not himself that day. He was subdued, and he was waiting for that second call from Pease Air Force Base. And my father said that Barney described to him those entities that he saw on the craft, and that he was very clear about what he saw, but he was also frightened and was trying to forget about it.
Talk a little bit more about what Barney said about what these beings looked like. They wore shiny black uniforms. What else could you say about what Barney said about what they looked like?
Well, I will have to jump ahead to the report that the NICAP investigator wrote after he interviewed Betty and Barney together, or separately first, and then together for 6 hours. Walter Webb was the initial investigator. He was an astronomer at the Hayden Planetarium in Boston. He had actually worked on the satellite program with Dr. Alan Hynek. He knew he had an interest in this, and he was very scientific in what he did. Barney described to him that the individuals that he was looking at appeared to, or reminded him of the military in their movements, how they all moved at once. He described the shiny black uniforms. He said that one of them had a smiling face that reminded him of the smile of an Irishman. I believe that was in the report. But the Irish were prejudiced against blacks. And so Barney didn't feel comfortable with what he was saying. He could not really remember the features on the face. He knew, as Walter Webb wrote in the report, that these entities were somehow not human.
So we're not talking about the typical gray alien.
And we're not talking about Nazis either.
Yeah, okay.
Some people have speculated that they were looking at Nazis on a craft. No,
So
no.
Kathleen,
We are, what he saw was obviously not human. Before he underwent hypnosis with Dr. Benjamin Simon, a little more than 2 years later, through a referral, because he had developed post-traumatic stress disorder.
I would bet he did.
He did. They called it conversion hysteria and shell shock in those days when Dr. Simon was developing the very special technique that he used with Betty and Barney. Dr. Simon was a lieutenant colonel in the Army during World War II when he developed this technique, and he was treating veterans who were returning from the war front. In fact, his work was so successful that a movie was made about him. It was a John Huston propaganda film called Let There Be Light. And so he was a very good person to work with Barney, who had developed bleeding ulcers, ended up in the hospital, had to take a leave of absence from work, wasn't able to sleep. He was very troubled. And I think he was so troubled because he was the one who had the conscious recall of going into that field and looking up at those non-human entities and being fearful that he was going to be captured.
And as I recall, Barney died relatively young. And I wondered if this experience had something to do with that.
He was only 46 years old when he died. He died in 1969. And my gosh, I do think that the stress of all of it caused Barney to have the cerebral hemorrhage. He probably had a pre-existing condition. I know that during World War II, he was involved in a percussion accident. I had a neighbor who is a medical doctor, but he was over treating soldiers in Afghanistan. And he was in a percussion accident bomb, and he ended up having a stroke, but he survived. Barney, could have had the same weakness in a blood vessel in his head because of that percussion accident. There is a history of strokes in his family. His father died from a stroke, but he was much older than Barney when he died.
Well, I have a question just as far as Kathleen, your opinion on something. The way that these entities acted were reminiscent of a military unit, soldiers maybe acting as a unit, and that seems to be a theme that you read about in a lot of reports, that the entities act almost as if they're machines in some ways, which you could confuse with military, because that's, the military is synchronized actions operating as a unit instead of individuals. I wonder, what are your thoughts about the possibility that these things, these entities, were machines either trying to present, machine may be too simplistic, cyborgs, some cybernetic, some sort of drones, whatever. Were they trying to present a sort of a screen that gave the impression of military action, or was it just the human interpretation of something that's so foreign that was really what the impression that Barney came away with?
Well, we know today that it is these smaller entities with larger heads in comparison to the size of their bodies who act as the guards. When I hypnotized Denise Stoner when I was working on her case, she called them soldiers. She said they're soldiers. They only move when they're told to do so. And so they are either, maybe biomechanical or just robots, the smaller ones, who do the work of capturing the humans, taking them to craft, helping them to undress, guarding the craft to make sure that nothing of theirs is taken off the craft, that kind of thing. So yes, Betty and Barney saw two different groups on the craft, and one of those groups acted as I just described.
So they're kind of the grunt, the front line, the soldier, as you say. So, well, continue into the interactions then. The next part of the story is where it gets even more interesting, right?
Yes. How do they get to Dr. Simon?
Okay. Well, Barney developed post-traumatic stress disorder, and bleeding ulcers, and he started to see a psychiatrist in Exeter, New Hampshire. And then one day when he was in the office, he started to talk about how he and Betty had driven up to the White Mountains again, that they were looking for the spot where the craft had landed, where they found themselves on that dirt road. And the doctor realized that this was very troubling to Barney. And he didn't use hypnosis, but he knew of Dr. Simon. Dr. Simon had a wonderful reputation in his field. So he made the referral to Betty and Barney. Dr. Simon thought he was seeing only Barney, but Betty accompanied him to the first meeting they had in December of 1963, and said that she wanted to be hypnotized as well. So Dr. Simon developed a plan where he would take each of them individually, hypnotize them, and then reinstill the amnesia that they each had. So there were two reasons for that. One was so that they couldn't share their memories with one another and contaminate each other's information. The other was that some of the emotion that was released in hypnosis was so intense that he feared that if he allowed them to remember all of this at once, that it would cause a greater sense of shock, trauma, and psychological disturbance.
I put on our website, Anomalies website, an excerpt from one of those sessions with Barney, and you can hear the fear in his voice. You could just hear how traumatic it was.
Yes, and that was when he was standing in the field. And he did not want to go beyond that with Dr. Simon. And he said to Dr. Simon, I don't want to remember anything more. Please, doctor, don't make me go forward. And Dr. Simon said, you'll do okay. We've made it this far. And he forced Barney to face that. And that's when Barney had a huge abreaction, emotional release under hypnosis, as he was remembering standing in that field and feeling that he was going to be captured as he was observing these non-humans that he could now, under hypnosis, remember in terms of their facial features. So, Betty and Barney ended up on that dirt road. There was the roadblock they remembered. The entities broke into two groups. One went to Barney's side, one went to Betty's side. Betty and Barney were talking to each other saying, what's this? Is there an accident ahead? And then Barney saw the entities coming toward the car. And he said, it's the ones I saw when I was standing in the field. And Betty became terrified. She opened the car door and was going to run into the woods and hide, but they intercepted her. And at this point, she was crying in terror. And she said to me that it was the most terrified she had ever been in her entire life. And one of them pointed something at her, and she lost consciousness. Barney opened the door himself. He put his foot out onto the dirt. He had his gun, but he didn't go for it because he thought he might be harmed. And they just took him. He felt like he was floating. He couldn't feel them supporting him, but he thought that they must be supporting him around his arms. And what he was describing with his eyes closed was that he could feel the toes of his shoes bumping along the rocks as he was being taken down this path. And then he could feel the toes of his shoes slide up an incline and bump at the top. And he described the feeling that it was like a submarine where you had to step over that part of it to go inside. And he was taken inside and taken to an examining room. Betty, on the other hand, was taken behind Barney. I think it was behind. She must have been ahead of Barney. And the leader said to her, she was yelling, Barney, wake up, Barney. And the leader said to her, is his name Barney? And Betty said, it's none of your business what his name is. And so they got to, she had woken up. She was now at that ramp going up into the craft, and she decided she wasn't going. She didn't know what was going to happen. She didn't know if she was going to be taken to some distant planet, if she'd ever see her family again. And she decided to fight. And she kicked the one on one side. And in doing so, she tore the hem down on her dress and tore the dress from waist to hemline. They took control of her again and took her onto the craft and put her in the examining room. And there was in her room the one that she called the leader and the one that she called the examiner. And they started examining her, took her shoes off, examined her joints, her hands, her feet, her arms. They opened her mouth and looked in her mouth and saw teeth in there and a tongue. They checked out her ears, her nose, her hair. They took skin scrapings.
Didn't they insert a needle in her abdomen?
That was later.
That was later.
Okay. But later, yes, they took her to a table. The first place she was on was something like a very modern dentist chair. She was reclining, but not fully reclining. Then they took her to the table and tried to unzip her zipper to remove her dress. And that's when the zipper was, the fabric was torn, and the thick fabric next to the zipper was torn. They couldn't get it. They finally must have figured out how and unzipped it, and the dress dropped to the floor. She was then told to get on the table. She's on the table. The examiner is down at one end of the table, the one she called the leader, which we know is the escort, the one who communicates with the abductee through telepathy, was by Betty's head. And so the examiner produced a large needle. And Betty said, what are you going to do with that? And the message that she received is that it was some kind of a pregnancy test. And she said, we don't have anything like this on Earth. She said, what are you going to do with it? And he said, I'm just going to insert it into your navel. It's only a simple test. And she said, don't do it. Don't do it. In fact, she was so traumatized over this experience that Dr. Simon had to end the session early because he plunged that needle into her navel anyway. And she compared it to a knife entering her navel, not a needle. But as she was screaming out in pain, the one that she called the leader did something around her face. And when he did that, all of the pain went away. And she began to trust him. The exams were done. They checked her nervous system as well. The exams were done, and she was left alone in the room with the leader. And the examiner went into Barney's room and did the same types of tests with Barney, only he took a sperm sample from Barney. When Betty was in the room with the leader, she began to look around. She began to trust him. And she found what she at that time called a book. But when in the year 2000, I asked her to sketch the symbols inside that book, she described it to me as being more like a tablet. It had a very stiff, thin cover. And she opened it up, and there embedded were 5 rows of symbols. They weren't anything like she saw before on this earth. They appeared to be vertically placed rather than horizontal. And so she just looked at those for a little while, and she said to the leader, "I would like to take this book home with me as evidence that this has really happened." And he said, "Yes, you can take that book home." And she said to him, "Well, I know you're not from around here. Where is your home port?" And he produced a star map that has been described a couple of different ways. One way was that it was like looking out a window, and there were stars of various sizes and colors, and some were connected by solid lines, some were connected by dotted lines. And she was made to understand that the 2 circles on the forefront of that map that were about the size of nickels had 6 lines between them. And those were places where those entities traveled back and forth. They were like trade routes. They went there often. And then there were several other stars on that map that had solid lines going to them. And there were others that had dotted lines. And so she looked at it and she looked at it. And the other description that she had of it is that it might have been a holographic image, but that was much later.
Now, I was going to say, as I recall, that map, she doesn't take the map with her or the book, but that map shows up again later on in the story. Is that correct?
It does. Do you want to hear what happened later in the story, or do you want to hear what happened next?
Well, you take us where you want to take us.
Okay. Let me go to the star map a little bit later, because that takes a long time. What happened next was that Barney his examination had been completed. And those little guys had him, and they were escorting him from the craft. They came to get Betty, too. They were going to take them down to the car together. And they noticed that Betty had that book. And they would not let her take that book off the craft. And Betty was so angry that she was arguing with the leader. She said, "You told me that I could keep that. You're breaking your word. You said I could have that as evidence, and now you're taking it away from me." And he said, "I'm sorry, but it's not my decision to make. They made the decision. And I know why now. It's because they're the guards. They make sure you don't get off the craft with anything that belongs to them." So Barney was taken down first and put into the car and sat on his gun, actually. The dog remained in the car, shaking and shivering as far into the seat as she could fit. He picked her up and put her on the seat. And then the leader took Betty down to the car. And on the way, she really liked this guy at this point. She could trust him. And she said, do you think you'll come back again? Because there are people that I'd like you to meet. She said, I'm just an average person, but there are other people who have a lot more knowledge than me. And maybe I could set up a meeting for you. And do you think you'll come back? And he said, the decision is not mine to make. Maybe we will. And Betty said, well, how would you find me? Of all the people in this world, how would you find me? And he said, we always find those we are looking for.
Oh, boy.
That there was a way, and she probably had an implant already. That's the way I think of it.
Do you think it was unusual that Betty kind of liked this one individual after all the terrible things that had been done? Do you find it unusual that she kind of bonded in some way with the leader?
Well, he removed her pain.
There you go.
And as I said, he apologized to her. I'm sorry that we frightened you. And we told you that we were just going to do a few simple tests and you'd be on your way. And so I don't know if she recognized him from previous times. That never came out. But she did kind of have a bond with him. She thought of him as a kind, caring individual. And even though she said to him, he said, the crew has decided that it wouldn't be good for you and Barney to remember this. And Betty said, if it's the last thing I ever do, I'm going to remember this. And she was determined. And so he said, well, maybe you will. But Barney might not remember it the way you do. In fact, he won't remember it the way you do. And all you'll do is confuse each other. So you should just forget about it. He took her down to the car and he said to her that it would be okay for them, it would be safe for them to watch the craft leave. So then Betty went to Barney's side of the car and told him that he could get out. She went to the passenger side and lifted the dog out and was holding the dog. As they saw this craft roll over and over into a red-orange ball or a huge red-orange orb and lift up into the sky. That's what she remembered. And the next thing they knew, they're on the road that they had been on before, only they're 35 miles south. So get on to the star map research. Betty and Barney, let me first say, never wanted this story to be told.
I bet they didn't.
They had a lot to lose, far more to lose than they could gain out of it.
Well, I'm wondering to what degree. I mean, this is the 60s, and we're talking about an interracial marriage. So if you're an experiencer, that's kind of tricky under any social circumstance. But when you're a white woman married to an African American in the 60s, there's a kind of additional stigma that goes on there. It seemed like that to me, anyway.
Yeah, there was still prejudice in New Hampshire. And so for a variety of reasons, they did not want to draw attention to themselves, right, except for in the civil rights movement, for the causes that they worked for. So they were willing to tell the Air Force, the UFO researchers, to talk to their friends who were in the military, the family, but they didn't want this story out. But in 1965, a newspaper reporter from Boston, from the Herald Traveler, got in touch with Betty and Barney. He'd heard about their story and wanted to interview them. And they said, no, we won't do this interview with you. We don't want anyone to know about this. And so he conducted his own investigation. In fact, he found witnesses to that craft that night.
Really?
In the White Mountains of New Hampshire. He found at least a dozen.
Really?
Yes. And he was the one who first brought the story to the public 5 nights in the Boston newspaper. And then it was published elsewhere. This was a big story. And Betty and Barney decided then that they would speak to the public for the first time. And so there was a meeting held at the Unitarian Church in Dover, New Hampshire. It was November 3rd. It was sleeting. The weather was very cold and terrible, but the church was filled. The basement of the church was filled, and there were people waiting outside the church too in that weather. Guess who introduced Betty and Barney that night? The public information officer from Pease Air Force Base.
So
and they didn't talk about their abduction, but they talked about their sighting.
So, and I'm covering ground you're familiar with. I don't think Dave might be familiar. You probably know the name Bryce Zabel.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So I was listening to an interview with him about his upcoming project, which is to remake the book that you and Stanton Friedman wrote called Captured, which is kind of an update of your aunt and uncle's story. But one of the things I found kind of interesting about what he said is he said that Pease Air Force Base at that time had become the repository of the American nuclear arsenal that had moved from Roswell, New Mexico in the 1940s. And so the implication was that maybe the UFO was hanging around in that vicinity because of the nuclear weapons.
I think, yes, and we know that UFOs were seen over many nuclear bases, and
right.
Portsmouth's Pease Air Force Base was one of them. And so the entities were very concerned about contamination. They've told experiencers time and time again, dating back to 1954, as far as I've traced it, that they do not approve of our use of nuclear weapons, or our warlike behavior, and they have a real problem with that. So, yes.
Well, so do I. I guess I'm with the aliens in that respect.
I have a problem with it too.
We've got about 10 minutes or so left in our interview. Yeah. I tend to be the clock watcher. So, what else? What are we missing here?
I've got a couple questions that are.
Go ahead, Dave.
But I have something that I want to say. Can I say something?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Not only did we write the book Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience in 2007, but I have just updated that book for the 60th anniversary of Betty's and Barney's Experience. It can be pre-ordered at Barnes & Noble. I have copies of it that I sell on my website at Kathleen-Marden.com, autographed copies. And this is a big year because I have updated it with all of the scientific investigation that has been done on their case since 2007. And when I wrote that book, I didn't stop my investigation. I've been in touch with many scientists, and it's exciting that it is being updated, and that Bryce Zabel hopefully will make a movie or a
mini-series. He was talking about a mini-series, yeah.
Yes.
I didn't realize, and many people probably don't, that there is, like you mentioned, there were 12 witnesses, independent corroboration.
I didn't know that either.
And the idea that there's more scientific evidence, to me, is exciting. Some people are just more interested in the emotional aspect and the bigger picture, but I do like to get down into the weeds, so to speak, and sounds like you do too, to some extent. So that is exciting. We'll be sure to check out that book for sure. It's not released yet, though, right? It's a pre-order.
You can order copies from me because I have my copies.
Oh, okay.
Or you can pre-order in multiple formats from Barnes & Noble or Amazon.
Okay, and so I have a question regarding you mentioned a roadblock. Now, what did they mean specifically about a roadblock?
They remembered men standing in the road. What they were remembering were those non-human entities standing in the road, and one of them had a light.
So it was the entities themselves. It wasn't
the
American or some other military, Earth-based military, as far as you can tell?
It was the entities themselves that they remembered.
Okay, because I'm always very wary and suspicious of government, U.S. and other involvement in some of these, especially when you mentioned where peace is in relation to nuclear facilities and so on, because the various factions of our governments obviously are aware of, even back in the 60s and probably long before, aware of these incidents. And so they tend to pop up somewhere in every story to some extent. So it's very interesting that they were introduced by, who was it again? The P's, the
Public information.
Oh, that they were introduced, yes, by the
PIO,
public,
the public
information
information
officer at Pease Air Force Base.
They need to have their fingers in it somewhere, if not all over everywhere when one of these things comes up. So I'm always looking for that. But the other thing that really I cannot get my brain around, wrap my brain around, and I'd like to hear your opinion, Kathleen, is of these so-called examinations. To me, they seem so, what's the word, antiquated, so out of place in these experiences, because entities that can traverse space and time and have command over gravity, blah, 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 why in God's name would they need to break out a giant needle and jab you through, in the most painful, most fear-provoking way? And why would they need to do skin scrapings? My wife is a veterinarian. We do skin scrapings on pets all the time because it's a very simple procedure. Then you look under a microscope. But how is it that these entities are not capable of remotely, doing these things without, even in the 60s, without blatant, scary techniques? To me, they seem to be designed to provoke reactions or to invoke fear, and that's the only thing. So it's almost as if these entities are, harvesting some fear, and then they come back and say, "Oh, everything's okay. It's okay. We're your friend," but they're not really your friend. Huh?
They were harvesting human genetic material.
Well, wouldn't there be a different way to achieve that? I mean, theoretically, and that's what's very difficult. Or how about anesthesia? We can do anesthesia and you would avoid the whole fear reaction and the pain in the first place. So that's what's baffling to me. So I'm wondering about your opinion on that.
Well, that's one problem that I have with these non-human entities, is that they do not remove the pain until the person feels that pain. Right. They could very well protect that person in advance. And I don't know why that is, if they don't understand the human population that well. They're so different than we are that,
right.
And they don't have, they have a long-term relationship with those individuals that they take, but it's maybe 2 hours out of an entire year, or maybe twice a year for 2 hours. I really can't answer your question. I'd like to get inside the alien mind.
It's disturbing, isn't it? Because
I can't do that.
It makes me think of how we humans treat livestock, for example.
Yes.
We could anesthetize every cow before we do whatever we do, or pig at the slaughter, but we don't do that. And why do we not do that? Well, because it's expensive, but also because we don't have empathy for that particular being. Right. We see them as an animal. And I'm wondering if that's the reasonable conclusion here, is that the aliens, as a general term, see us as lesser beings, as animals. And the alternative is that they are doing a psychological mind game on us to create a certain atmosphere or arena or fear or whatever. That's, to me, has always been the really difficult thing to try to understand here. And maybe we just aren't capable of understanding it. But the other thing I want to say is that Betty and Barney were a very unique, again, interracial couple. They were not chosen at random, I don't think. I don't think you can make any argument for that being random. They were chosen for a specific reason. And so do you have thoughts about that?
I think that it's a longitudinal genetic study, that they are attempting to upgrade the human genome in order to move us along on an evolutionary scale. They, when experiencers finally can get beyond fear and can communicate and project love toward these entities, they receive information. And I've received information from individuals, and I have communicated with these entities telepathically myself.
Okay.
And, what they say that they planted our seed on this planet, and they come back periodically to assist in our development. But, when we started exploding nuclear bombs, they really grew concerned. Prior to that, they came back about once a century. And if you go back and you look at the history, they were around in the 1850s. They came back in the 1940s, and they just stayed at that point. They remained here. And we know that they were collecting early on soil samples, plant samples, DNA from different animals, and finally human DNA.
Do you think the animal, excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt. Do you think the animal DNA collection kind of explains the cattle mutilation phenomena?
There's possibly, but they could also be testing for contaminants in the human body. That's what the scoop marks, I've been told, are for, to test the contaminants. And I don't think that they're enjoying harming humans. I think that their goal is to help us along, these primitive creatures along, so that we will survive on this beautiful planet, that we will not destroy all life on this planet through our own behavior. So I think that it's a longitudinal study and process. And I think that they're collecting all of this DNA, sort of like Noah's Ark, so that if we do destroy this planet, they can take that DNA and maybe seed it elsewhere, or when this planet can sustain life again, they would seed it here.
No, the way that they do it is baffling to me, though, as I've kind of, we're talking about for the past few minutes, and Dan brought up the cattle mutilation and other animal mutilation phenomenon. And the way that that's done is disturbing, because really the entities will take the cow or whatever and do their thing on it, and they'll just drop it unceremoniously in a field where everyone can see it, where it's obvious that it's been taken and mutilated. And so the aliens, in quotes, they're missing a very valuable part of the equation, in my opinion, or at least that's what it appears. And they're lacking some sort of empathy or feeling for what they're doing. They don't understand how humans will react, or they don't care. And the last thing I'll say is, I talked to Linda Moulton Howe about this. I asked her, why do they leave the carcass? Why not just have an alien farm up in the mountains where no one's ever going to see it, and do your own DNA studies and blah, blah, blah. She said they do it because they can. Mm-hmm. They leave it there because they can, which implies that there's some sort of motive for doing it the way they do it. And the human abduction thing is the same in my mind too. They do it that way because they need it to be perceived a certain way, because they can do it a lot more stealthily and a lot more with less pain and so on. So I think you're onto something there when you say.
I asked about that.
Huh?
I asked about that.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And the reply was, you eat your own, don't you?
Right. That's true.
Why is it such a big deal for us to take these cattle when you eat your own?
Well, I mean, yeah, there's a certain sort of logic there that it's hard to deny that. So I guess.
Well, as usually happens in these conversations, is it seems like they've just started and then they've got to end because of time constraints. But I mean, you made Betty and Barney Hill real to me. I suppose reading that book a long time ago and seeing some of the things I've seen about your aunt and uncle, I mean, you just really put a significant layer of humanity on both of these people and the extraordinary thing that they've gone through, and that's prompted you to do what you've done through the ERT program and MUFON. So I really appreciate you taking the time to be on with us. We'll market when Dave puts the show up on YouTube, we'll mark it captured. And now I know where that term comes from. I haven't that book, but now you've told us where that term comes from. Kathleen, any final thoughts you have before we let you get back to the Florida sunshine?
Did you want to just give your overview of the star map, because we didn't make it to that? Is that part of the story?
Yeah.
I mean,
we ran out of time, didn't we?
We have a general time limit, but if you want to talk about that briefly, I'm interested in hearing just your overview.
Sure, let's do that.
It was published in the first book, The Interrupted Journey, and Marjorie Fish, a brilliant woman from Ohio, saw that map, and she, being an amateur astronomer, thought that if this place existed in our galaxy, that she might be able to find it. At first, she thought she'd find lots of matches. In the end, after several years of looking, she found only one, and that was only after a new catalog had been published and updated with updated distance data, and with now 2 stars that were in 55 light years of the sun that had not even been in the catalogs prior to that. So she was meticulous in her research. In all, she built 14 models using frames and monofilament line and beads of different sizes and different colors corresponding to the different stars in our galaxy out 55 light years from the sun. And finally, she took that new catalog, the information from the new catalog. She had to do all of the math to know where to put these stars. And she rearranged some of the stars in that 14th model. And there she had a match for Betty's map. The 2 stars, the large ones in the forefront, were Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2 in the constellation the Net, that are about 39 light years away from Earth. Our sun, is on the map as well. I can't wait for us to actually explore Zeta Reticuli. We haven't done that. It's just so far away, and as our technology develops, hopefully they will look in that direction.
Well, that's amazing. Yeah, you kind of live in an area here in this subject where you're walking between science and emotion and this bizarre experience. I mean, they're light years, pun intended, I guess, apart, those 2 topics, but maybe they're not so far apart. Maybe that's the lesson we're trying to learn, is to meld our scientific, our logical minds with the other side and learn to understand that everything's connected at some level. And as you said, to treat our home much better and each other much better, because we're not doing a great job of that even in 2021.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And, my background is in social science. Mm-hmm. Stanton's was in physical science. He was a physicist. Right. So we worked very well together because we had those scientific perspectives that we talked about, we shared with one another, and we wrote about in 3 books actually together.
Well, we need more of that, I think. And Betty and Barney Hill were, whether they wanted to be or not, they are a turning point in this phenomenon, this study, and forever will be. So hopefully we can learn from their experiences, some of which were not pleasant for them. I'm sure they were. Did you ever ask them afterwards if they wished that it could never have happened to them?
Barney died when I was only 20 years old.
Yeah.
So, or 21. So, no, I didn't ask him, but I asked Betty, and she thought it was the greatest experience of her life. Yes.
Well,
she was pleased that it had
turning into a positive for sure. And we're better for it, I think.
I agree.
So I don't, well, I could keep going, but I will stop here, Dan. Do you have any other questions? We'll let Kathleen get back to the sun, like you said.
Yeah, well, just once again, Kathleen, thank you so much for being on with us. Once Dave gets this, he does all the editing, which, Dave's just a phenomenal person. He's a great interviewer and a good technical person. So that should be up, I don't know when, Dave, but last time we did an interview, you had it up the night we did the interview. So Dave does phenomenal stuff.
That was an anomaly for sure.
Okay, yes, anomaly. So he'll send you a link once the program's edited. But thank you very much for being on with us.
It was my pleasure, and I just want to add that all the stars on that star map had special properties, and it's all in the book.
I'm going to have to get a copy.
Betty and Barney Hill.
We're going to get a copy of that book for sure.
60th anniversary.
Yeah,
how could it
a long time has passed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you, Kathleen. We appreciate it.
All right, enjoy the rest of your day.
Pleasure talking to you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.